There are moments in life when reality shifts, when the veil between our world and something else grows thin. These are not stories conjured from imagination. They are real experiences, lived by real people, passed down through families and etched into memories. In this collection, we delve into 10 profound accounts of supernatural encounters, spanning generations and crossing continents. From the whispers of guardian angels to the dark shadows that follow families, from childhood encounters with the unknown to inherited spiritual sensitivities that persist through bloodlines. These stories remind us that the paranormal isn't confined to ancient buildings or forgotten graveyards. It manifests in modern apartments, office buildings, and family homes. It follows some families across oceans, while others inherit the ability to peer beyond our physical realm. Some see shadow figures in the corner of their eyes. Others wake to mysterious music or unexplained footsteps. Children speak to invisible friends who turn out to be long-departed relatives. Mothers pass down warnings about spectral black and white dogs that appear before death. These aren't isolated incidents. They're threads in a larger tapestry of supernatural experiences that connect families across generations. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, these accounts offer a glimpse into experiences that defy conventional explanation. They challenge our understanding of reality and remind us that perhaps, just perhaps, there's more to our world than what meets the eye. Welcome to Unexplained Haunts, a collection of true ghost stories that will make you question what lies beyond the boundaries of our everyday existence. In the dark corners of our everyday world, there exist moments that defy explanation, experiences that make us question everything we believe about reality. These are not tales spun from imagination, but real encounters that have left their mark on those who lived them. As you read these stories, remember, they happened to ordinary people, in ordinary places, on what began as ordinary days. What follows is a collection of true supernatural encounters, each one preserved as faithfully as memory allows. They serve as windows into the unknown, reminding us that sometimes the line between our world and whatever lies beyond is thinner than we think. When you spend years collecting tales of the supernatural, certain accounts stand out, stories that carry such visceral fear and bewilderment that they leave an indelible mark on both teller and listener. As I sat across from Michael in his modest living room, I could see how deeply this experience had affected him, even years later. His hands trembled slightly as he began to share what happened on that summer evening, an encounter that would forever change how he perceives the simple joy of an ice cream truck's melody. The day had been ordinary enough, Michael recalled. He'd been enjoying the cooling evening air on his front porch, watching the sun paint the sky in muted purples and oranges. The crickets were singing their evening chorus, and the air hung heavy with the promise of another peaceful summer night. That's when everything changed. I still remember the exact moment, Michael told me, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The crickets just stopped, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The first notes floated through the gathering dusk like poisoned honey. Initially, Michael thought nothing of it. Ice cream trucks were common in his neighborhood during summer evenings. But as the melody of "Do Your Ears Hang Low" continued, his body tensed. Something was terribly wrong with the music. It was playing backwards, he explained, running a hand through his graying hair. Not like someone had simply reversed a recording. It was as if each note was being pulled inside out, twisted into something that shouldn't exist in our world. Michael stood from his porch swing, drawn despite his growing unease. The streetlights had just flickered to life, casting long shadows across the empty road. No ice cream truck in sight, no vehicle at all. Yet, the backwards melody grew stronger, following the exact route their neighborhood ice cream truck always took. When he showed me his phone recording from that night, I heard nothing but harsh static punctuated by occasional bursts of sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But Michael swears the actual music was crystal clear, each reversed note more disturbing than the last. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in the air, Michael continued, absently rubbing his arms at the memory. The street light above me started flickering, and in those moments of darkness, he paused, gathering courage. I saw something, a shape, like an ice cream truck, but wrong. It was transparent, distorted, as if it was trying to exist in our reality but couldn't quite manage it. Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the otherworldly sound. The Patels from next door stood frozen on their driveway, their young children hiding behind them. The usually boisterous Thompson kids, who typically raced to greet any ice cream truck, pressed themselves against their front windows, none daring to step outside. Then came what Michael describes as the most disturbing part: the laughter. High-pitched, childlike giggles layered over the backwards melody, echoing down the empty streets. It sounded like children, he said, but no child should laugh like that. It was as if something was trying to mimic children's laughter, but didn't quite understand how it should sound. The phenomenon lasted exactly 23 minutes. Michael checked his phone's clock obsessively throughout the experience. The music never deviated from its path, never broke its pattern. Then, as suddenly as it began, it started to fade, not gradually, as a departing vehicle would cause, but as if reality itself was being dialed down. As our interview concluded, Michael led me to his front porch, the same one where he'd first heard the phantom music. Standing there in the growing darkness, he shared one final observation that chilled me to the bone. "You know what's strange?" he said, gazing out at the quiet street. "That backwards tune. It wasn't just playing in reverse. It was like each note was being unmade, like it was showing us what music sounds like when it's dying. Sometimes, on quiet evenings like this, I think I catch a few backwards notes floating on the breeze, and I wonder if it's still out there, that thing pretending to be an ice cream truck, playing its twisted melody for someone else." Not all encounters with the supernatural bring terror and unease. As I prepared to hear my next witness's account, I realized I was about to learn of a very different kind of visitor, one that brought light rather than darkness, and hope instead of fear. Sometimes the supernatural reveals itself not through terror, but through moments of profound wonder and protection. As I settled in to interview Rachel, a soft-spoken woman in her mid-30s, I noticed how her eyes lit up with a mixture of awe and residual disbelief as she prepared to share her encounter with what she believes were guardian angels. "Most people don't believe me when I tell them this story," Rachel began, adjusting herself in her armchair. "I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it firsthand." It was a moonless night when Rachel found herself driving home alone on a particularly treacherous stretch of mountain road. The darkness seemed absolute, broken only by her headlights as they cut through the thick fog that had settled in the valley. She remembers checking her watch. 2:47 a.m. "I was exhausted," she admitted, "but I needed to get home to my children." The babysitter was already staying later than planned. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "That's when I saw them. 3 glowing figures standing in the middle of the road." The figures appeared humanoid, but were composed entirely of soft, white light. Rachel described them as being about 6 feet tall, their forms slightly translucent yet distinctly visible against the darkness. They stood in a triangle formation, arms raised in what appeared to be a warning gesture. Rachel's instincts kicked in, and she slammed on her brakes. As her car skidded to a halt, the fog briefly cleared, revealing a massive fallen tree blocking the entire road, exactly where she would have crashed had she continued driving. When I looked back to thank them, they were gone, Rachel whispered. But the air, it felt different, charged, somehow. And there was this scent, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something sweeter, like lilies. But the encounter wasn't over. As Rachel sat there, trying to process what had happened, she felt a gentle warmth envelop her, despite her car's heater being off. 3 white feathers materialized on her dashboard, appearing out of nowhere. "I still have those feathers," she told me, retrieving a small box from a nearby shelf. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay 3 perfectly preserved white feathers that seemed to emit a faint, otherworldly glow even in the daylight of her living room. They haven't degraded or changed in all these years, and sometimes, when I'm particularly troubled, they give off that same warm glow I saw that night. The experience changed Rachel's entire perspective on the supernatural. I used to think ghost stories were just that, stories, she reflected. But after that night, I realized there are forces watching over us, protecting us. Not all supernatural encounters are meant to frighten us. Some are meant to save us. As I left Rachel's house that evening, I couldn't help but reflect on how differently each person experiences their brush with the supernatural. Some encounters are singular events that last mere minutes, while others, like our next witness's story, span decades. Looking down at my notes, I prepared myself for what would be one of the most extensive accounts I'd ever documented. A lifetime of supernatural experiences that began in childhood and never truly ended. Some people experience a single supernatural event that changes their life forever. Others, like Jennifer, seemed to live with one foot perpetually in the paranormal world. As we sat in her kitchen, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the worn wooden table, I could see the weight of decades of unexplained experiences in her eyes. "It's never really stopped," Jennifer began, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Most people have one ghost story. I have a lifetime of them." Her first encounter came at age 7. She'd woken in the middle of the night to find a dark figure standing in her doorway. Initially, she thought it was her father checking on her, until she realized she could see straight through it. Throughout her teenage years, the activity intensified. Objects would move on their own, often in broad daylight. Keys would vanish from countertops, only to reappear in locked drawers. Doors would slam shut in windless rooms. The family dog would track invisible entities across the house, its eyes following something no one else could see. "The storage room was the worst," Jennifer revealed, her voice dropping. "No matter how many times we cleaned it, it would be in disarray the next day. Tools scattered, boxes moved, and always that feeling of being watched." When Jennifer was 16, they discovered that a previous resident had died of a heart attack in that very room. But it wasn't until her cousin, known for her sensitivity to spirits, visited that they realized the full extent of the haunting. "My cousin walked into the house and immediately went pale," Jennifer recalled. She said there wasn't just one spirit, there were several. Some had been there long before the heart attack victim. They were drawn to the property, to our family, to me. The phenomena followed Jennifer when she moved out. New apartments, different cities. It didn't matter. The activity would start small. Lights flickering, electronics turning on and off, the sensation of being watched. Then it would escalate. 3:00 a.m. became my witching hour, she said with a wry smile. I'd wake up every night at exactly that time, sometimes to footsteps, sometimes to voices, sometimes to that bone-deep feeling that something was in the room with me. One particularly active period culminated in an event that Jennifer still struggles to discuss. All the bedroom doors in the house opened simultaneously at 3:00 a.m. The sound of a pill bottle being thrown against the wall echoed through the hallway. When I checked, there wasn't a single pill bottle in the house. I'd removed them all months before because of the activity. As our interview stretched into evening and shadows began to lengthen across her kitchen, Jennifer's cat suddenly focused on something behind me, its eyes growing wide. I felt a distinct cold spot brush past my shoulder, and Jennifer just nodded, unsurprised. "They're always here," she said quietly. "You learn to live with it. Some people have allergies or bad knees. I have spirits. It's just part of who I am now." As I left Jennifer's house that evening, my recorder full of hours of her experiences, I couldn't help but compare her lifetime of supernatural encounters with my next appointment. While Jennifer's experiences spanned decades, my next witness would share a concentrated period of intense activity that started in childhood, a series of events that would forever change their family's understanding of the paranormal world. When I first met David in his childhood home, now inherited from his grandparents. The weight of history hung heavy in every room. At 42, his hands still trembled when he spoke of the events that unfolded here during his youth. Some childhood memories fade with time. These had only grown sharper, etched deeper by years of trying to understand what he and his family had experienced. It started with footsteps. David began, his eyes fixed on the long hallway leading to his grandparents' old bedroom. Always at night, always when the house should have been silent. Heavy boots on hardwood floors, the kind my grandfather used to wear. But his grandfather had been dead for 3 months. The footsteps weren't random occurrences. They followed a precise pattern, starting at the back door, moving through the kitchen, down the hallway, past young David's room. Each night, the same route, the same deliberate pace, the same sudden silence. I was 8 when it began, David continued, leading me down that same hallway. My grandmother would rush us to the neighbor's house 2 doors down whenever it started. I didn't understand then why she looked so terrified. Later, I learned that was exactly how my grandfather would come home every night, through the back door, through the kitchen, down the hall. The footsteps were just the beginning. Voices started echoing through the house, whispered conversations that stopped the moment anyone tried to listen closely. The family would hear what sounded like their names being called from empty rooms. David's toys would rearrange themselves while he slept, sometimes forming perfect circles on his bedroom floor. As David showed me his old bedroom, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The worst was the night I woke up to someone sitting on my bed. I could feel the weight pressing down on the mattress, could see the depression in the blankets. But when I reached out, he swallowed hard. My hand passed through cold air. The activity reached its peak during a thunderstorm one spring night. David remembers every detail with haunting clarity. The flash of lightning that illuminated his room, the figure of his grandfather standing in the doorway, as solid as life, except for the fact that David could see the hallway, light through him. He looked at me with such sadness, David recalled, his voice cracking. Then he turned and walked through, not opened, walked through my grandmother's bedroom door. We heard her scream. When we ran to check on her, she was sitting up in bed, white as a sheet. She said she'd felt him lie down beside her, just like he used to every night. The next morning, they found all the family photos that had been tucked away in boxes scattered across the living room floor. Every single one featured David's grandfather. In each photo, his image had become blurry, while everything else remained crystal clear. My grandmother finally told me the truth then, David said, running his fingers along the hallway wall. My grandfather, he didn't just die. He took his own life, right here in this house. The guilt, she said, must have kept him here, walking his familiar path, trying to maintain his routine even after death. As we stood in the kitchen where it all began, a sudden chill passed between us. The overhead light flickered once, twice. David didn't seem surprised. He's still here, he said quietly. Not as active as before, but sometimes, On quiet nights, I still hear those footsteps, still following the same path, still trying to make it right. As I left David's house that evening, my thoughts turned to my next interview, another lifetime touched by the supernatural, but in a very different way. While David's experiences centered around a single location and spirit, my next witness would share a story of paranormal sensitivity that followed their family across generations, across continents, manifesting in ways that defied explanation. Some families passed down recipes or heirlooms. Alexandra's family inherited something far more extraordinary, a gift, or perhaps a curse, of supernatural sensitivity that spanned generations. As we sat in her garden, the wind chimes tinkling softly above us, she shared a legacy of paranormal experiences that began long before she was born. In my family, Alexandra began, her dark eyes distant with memory, we don't ask if someone sees spirits. We ask when they saw their first one. She touched a crystal pendant at her throat, a family heirloom that her grandmother swore helped control their gift. Mine appeared when I was 4. The sensitivity ran strongest through the women in her family. Her great-grandmother could predict deaths by seeing a black and white sheepdog that no one else could perceive. Her grandmother communicated with departed relatives. Her mother saw shadow people. For Alexandra, it began with the glowing children. They would appear in my room at night, she explained, her voice softening at the memory. 3 of them, always the same ones, playing games in the corner. They never spoke, just smiled and waved. I thought they were normal children until I mentioned them to my mother, and her face went white. She recognized their description. They were her childhood friends who had died in a car accident decades ago. As Alexandra grew older, her abilities expanded. Objects would move in her presence. Electronics malfunctioned regularly. She would wake exactly at 3:33 a.m. to find her room filled with whispers. But it was the inherited visions that proved most unsettling. The first time I saw the sheepdog, I was 12, she said, her hands trembling slightly. It appeared at the foot of my bed, just as my great-grandmother had described, black and white, spectral, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. 3 days later, we received news that my uncle had passed unexpectedly. Alexandra described how items from their old home would appear in their new house, only to vanish again. Family photographs would rearrange themselves overnight. Voices speaking their native language would echo through their English-speaking neighborhood. The most intense manifestation happened during my college years, Alexandra continued, pointing to a scar on her arm. I woke to find my grandmother's favorite brooch burning hot on my nightstand. A brooch that had been buried with her years before in our home country. The scar is from when I touched it. The brooch vanished by morning, but the mark remained. Her family had learned to live with their gift, developing rituals and practices to manage the constant supernatural activity. Salt lines at doorways, protective crystals in every room, regular sage cleansing. But sometimes, the other side broke through despite their precautions. Last Christmas, Alexandra whispered, leaning closer. During our family gathering, every single clock in the house stopped at midnight. In the silence that followed, we heard my grandmother's voice singing an old lullaby she used to sing to me. Everyone heard it, even the skeptical cousins who'd married into the family. The next morning, every clock resumed at exactly the right time, as if they'd never stopped. As darkness fell and our interview drew to a close, Alexandra's crystal pendant suddenly glowed with an inner light. She smiled sadly, touching it with gentle fingers. "Someone's trying to reach us now," she said softly. "They always know when we're talking about them." The sun had set completely by the time I left Alexandra's garden, her stories of generational supernatural sensitivity still echoing in my mind. But as I prepared for my next interview, I knew I was about to encounter something far darker. While Alexandra's family had learned to coexist with their supernatural gifts, my next witness would share a terrifying account of a malevolent entity that pursued their family across continents, proving that sometimes you can't escape what follows you. The moment I stepped into Marcus's study, I knew this interview would be different. Heavy curtains blocked the afternoon sun, and religious symbols from various faiths adorned every wall. Marcus, a distinguished man in his 50s, had insisted on meeting during daylight hours. "It's safer then," he'd said during our phone call. Now, sitting across from me, his hands clasped tightly together, he began to share why his family never feels truly safe, no matter where they go. "It started in our ancestral home in Greece," Marcus began, his accent thickening with emotion. "We thought we could escape it by moving to America, then to Canada, then Australia. But distance means nothing to this thing. It simply follows." The entity first manifested when Marcus was 13, shortly after his grandmother's death. It began subtly, shadows moving against the light. The smell of rotting flesh in spotlessly clean rooms, whispers in ancient Greek that none of the family spoke anymore. The first time I saw it clearly, I was in my bedroom doing homework, Marcus said, unconsciously making the sign of the cross. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. Then came that smell, like decay and sulfur. In my mirror's reflection, I saw it standing behind me. His description made my blood run cold. A tall, humanoid figure with elongated limbs and gray, leathery skin. Its face was almost human, but wrong. Eyes too large, mouth filled with needle-like teeth, fingers ending in points. But worst of all was its ability to speak. It knew things. Marcus whispered. Family secrets, past sins. It would whisper them in the voices of dead relatives. When we moved to America, it took great pleasure in telling us that oceans couldn't break its connection to our bloodline. The entity's activities escalated with each move. In Greece, it had mostly observed and whispered. In America, it began moving objects, creating poltergeist-like disturbances. In Canada, it started appearing in photographs, a dark, twisted shape standing among family members, its face always turned directly toward the camera. In Australia, it became bold enough to physically interact. Marcus continued, rolling up his sleeve to reveal 3 long, parallel scars. It would drag its claws across walls, leaving marks that would heal like skin, Family members would wake with bruises in the shape of handprints. Our youngest would talk about the gray man who stood over their beds at night. The family consulted priests, shamans, and paranormal experts across 4 continents. Some refused to help after merely hearing their story. Others tried interventions that seemed to work temporarily, only for the entity to return stronger than ever. The worst night was in Melbourne, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. It manifested fully during dinner. My mother-in-law had just taken a sip of water when it appeared beside her. The water in her glass turned black. When she screamed, the entity smiled, actually smiled, and every mirror in the house shattered simultaneously. Marcus pulled out a family photo album, pointing to various pictures. In each one, I could see what he meant: a dark, twisted figure lurking in the background, its form becoming clearer and more distinct in recent photos. In the latest family picture, its face was perfectly visible, wearing what could only be described as an expression of malicious glee. We've learned to live with it, Marcus concluded, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. We keep blessed items in every room. We never stay in one place too long. We warn new family members before they marry in. Some call us crazy until they experience it themselves. But the worst part? He leaned forward, his voice breaking. It's getting stronger, and I fear it's just been playing with us all these years. As if to punctuate his words, a shadow passed across the wall behind him. Too tall, too thin to be human. The temperature plummeted, and that sickly sweet smell of decay filled the air. Marcus didn't turn around. He didn't have to. It likes when we talk about it, he said quietly. It's here now, isn't it? Listening, waiting, always waiting. Leaving Marcus's house, I found myself checking my rearview mirror more often than necessary, half expecting to see elongated fingers reaching from my back seat. My next interview promised something different. Not an entity that followed across continents, but a lifetime of diverse supernatural encounters that defied explanation. Yet, as I drove, Marcus's words echoed in my mind. Some things choose you, and once they do, they never let go. Hear her, Claire explained, absently touching a crystal pendant at her throat. They thought I was making up stories until the day they found a daguerreotype in the attic. It was her, Elizabeth Montgomery, the original owner of this house. She died in 1873, but she was still watching over the children who lived here. Elizabeth was just the first of many entities that would populate Claire's extraordinary life. As she grew older, her abilities to perceive the supernatural expanded exponentially. The phenomena began manifesting in increasingly complex ways that defied conventional explanation. By age 7, I was experiencing what I now call temporal bleeds, Claire continued, retrieving a leather-bound journal from a nearby bookshelf. The first major incident happened in my bedroom. I woke up one night to find the room had transformed, gas lamps instead of electric lights, different wallpaper, furniture from another era. Through my window, I could see horse-drawn carriages on the street. She opened the journal, showing me detailed sketches of the room as it had appeared in different time periods. Each drawing was dated and annotated with specific details. Smells, sounds, temperature changes, and the entities she encountered during these temporal shifts. The spirits began to recognize that I could perceive them. Claire explained. They would leave me messages, moving objects into patterns, manipulating electronic devices, even writing in the condensation on mirrors. Some were benevolent, like Elizabeth. Others, she shuddered. Others were less friendly. One particularly malevolent entity began manifesting when Claire was 12. It would create cold spots so intense that ice would form on windows in the middle of summer. Objects would be thrown across rooms with devastating force. Family photos would be found with faces scratched out. That was when I met the guardians. Claire said, her eyes drifting to a corner of the room where the shadows seemed unusually deep. Tall, luminous beings that seemed to exist between dimensions. They appeared during a particularly violent paranormal attack and drove the malevolent entity away. They've been with me ever since, watching, protecting. The guardians weren't her only supernatural protectors. Throughout her teens, Claire encountered what she called timeline walkers, entities that seemed capable of moving freely through different periods of history. They would warn her of potential dangers, sometimes by manipulating events to prevent accidents or harmful encounters. Last year, she said, pulling out her phone, I managed to capture one of these interventions on video. The footage showed Claire about to cross a street. Suddenly, her keys flew from her hand, causing her to step back. Seconds later, a car ran the red light, passing through exactly where she would have been. In the frame, a tall, shadowy figure could be seen standing nearby, its form seeming to bend light around it. But it wasn't just protective entities that populated Claire's world. She described encounters with beings that seemed to transcend traditional supernatural categories. There are the echoes, fragments of past events that replay like loops in time. The shifters, entities that can manipulate physical matter. The watchers, beings that observe but never interact. And the ones I call the void dwellers, creatures that seem to exist in the spaces between realities. Each type of entity brought different manifestations. The echoes would cause Claire to experience historical events as if they were happening in real time. The shifters could manipulate objects, sometimes creating impossible configurations or causing items to exist in multiple states simultaneously. The watchers would appear during significant moments, their presence often heralding major life changes. The void dwellers are the most unsettling, Claire admitted, showing me another page in her journal. The drawing depicted a being that seemed to violate the laws of geometry, angles that couldn't exist, dimensions that hurt to look at. They don't interact like the others. They simply exist in ways our minds aren't equipped to comprehend. As if to emphasize her point, a book suddenly flew off a nearby shelf, hanging suspended in midair. Pages began turning on their own, stopping at specific passages that, when read in sequence, formed coherent messages. Claire calmly took notes, explaining that this was a common form of communication from what she called the librarians, entities with a particular affinity for written words. They're fascinated by human knowledge. she explained as the book gently returned to its shelf. They'll often lead me to specific books or documents that contain information I need, sometimes before I even know I need it. Last month, they guided me to a medical text that described symptoms my sister was experiencing before doctors could diagnose her condition. The phenomena weren't limited to her home. Claire's supernatural experiences followed her everywhere, though they often manifested differently in different locations. In hospitals, she would see departed souls helping guide new arrivals to the other side. In libraries, books would rearrange themselves into meaningful patterns. In old buildings, the temporal bleeds would become stronger, allowing her to witness layers of history simultaneously. One of the most intense experiences happened during a visit to Gettysburg, Claire recalled, retrieving another journal. I found myself experiencing the battle from multiple perspectives simultaneously. I could see the soldiers from both sides, hear their thoughts, feel their emotions, but I could also see the land as it exists now, and all the layers of time in between. It was overwhelming. The entry described how she witnessed phantom regiments marching through modern buildings, heard cannon fire echoing across centuries, and saw both past and present overlaid like double-exposed photographs. But most striking were the entities she encountered there, beings that seemed to exist specifically to help lost souls find their way home. They appeared as beings of pure light, she said, showing me sketches that seemed to shimmer on the page. They could move through time like we move through space, gathering souls that had become trapped in moments of trauma and helping them move on. I've seen them in other locations since then, always performing the same service. As our interview continued into the evening, the supernatural activity in the house seemed to intensify. Footsteps echoed from empty rooms. Voices whispered in languages long dead. Objects moved of their own accord. But Claire remained unperturbed, explaining that this was simply her normal. "You learn to adapt," she said, watching as a ceramic figurine danced across a side table. The extraordinary becomes ordinary when it's your daily reality. But it never stops being amazing. Each day brings new encounters, new understanding of just how vast and mysterious our universe really is. Before I left, Claire showed me one final piece of evidence, a series of photographs taken over several years. In each one, different entities could be seen. Orbs of light, shadow figures, full-bodied apparitions, and beings that defied description. But most striking was how the images seemed to change as we looked at them, the entities moving between photographs, as if the pictures themselves were windows into their world. "They're always here," Claire said softly, looking around at her seemingly empty house. "Some people live their lives never seeing what exists alongside us. I've never had that luxury, but I've come to understand that it's not a curse. It's a responsibility. These entities, these beings, they're part of our world, whether we perceive them or not. They have their own purposes, their own missions. Sometimes they need our help. Sometimes they help us. But they're always there, just beyond the veil of what most people consider reality." The streetlights flickered as I drove through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Portland, my thoughts still swimming with Claire's extraordinary accounts. A strange melancholy had settled over me, the kind that comes from glimpsing a world far vaster and more complex than our everyday reality suggests. But that melancholy would soon turn to something darker. My next destination was a coffee shop where the Martinez family had agreed to meet. They'd refused to let me visit their home, and now I understood why. Some places are safer than others. Isabella Martinez had said during our brief phone call, places with witnesses, with light, with people, places where they can't manifest as strongly. Such a simple word for something so terrifying. I arrived early, choosing a corner table that offered a clear view of both exits. The barista was wiping down counters, jazz playing softly overhead. Everything felt normal, mundane, but I'd learned that normal was often just a thin veneer, easily peeled away to reveal the horrors lurking beneath. The bell above the door chimed. The Martinez family entered. Father, mother, 2 teenage children, looking like any other family at first glance. But their eyes told a different story. They carried the haunted look of people who had learned to sleep with the lights on, who checked dark corners not out of paranoia, but necessity. Who knew that sometimes the things following you home aren't just shadows. As they approached my table, the overhead lights dimmed momentarily. A cup rattled on a distant counter. And though it was surely just my imagination, I could have sworn I saw something tall and dark pass behind them, moving through the coffee shop like ink through water. The Martinez family had a story to tell, a story of entities that had latched onto their bloodline generations ago, following them from Spain to Mexico to America. Entities that didn't just visit or manifest. They claimed ownership. And as Isabella Martinez sat down, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she would never drink, I prepared to document a tale of generational haunting that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the living and the dead. Isabella Martinez placed an old leather-bound diary on the coffee shop table, its pages yellow with age, the Spanish text faded but still legible. It began with my great-grandmother in Madrid, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wrote everything down, every encounter, every manifestation. We've all kept similar journals since then. We had to. No one would believe us otherwise. The coffee shop's warmth and gentle music created an illusion of safety. But the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen as Mr. Martinez began their story. Their youngest daughter, Ana, pressed closer to her mother, her eyes fixed on something behind me that I couldn't see. They first appeared after my great-grandmother visited a cemetery in Toledo. Isabella continued, turning the diary's brittle pages. She went to pay respects to a distant relative, but something followed her home. Something that had been waiting for someone who could see it. The entities, 3 distinct spirits, attached themselves to the family that day. The first manifested as a tall woman in a black dress, her face perpetually hidden by a dark veil. The second appeared as a young boy, but his movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise. The third never showed itself clearly, remaining a mass of shadows that moved against the natural flow of light. At first, they just watched. Mr. Martinez, a rational but fear-broken father, added, his accent thickening with emotion. They would stand in corners, follow family members from room to room, but then they started to interact. The veiled woman, a tall woman dressed in black, would appear in mirrors, standing behind family members, reaching for them with hands that seemed too long, fingers that ended in points. The boy, a childlike figure with uncanny, inhuman movements, would play with children's toys at night, but his games had a sinister edge. Dolls arranged in disturbing tableau, toy soldiers positioned like murder scenes. The shadow entity was the worst. Isabella, a gentle but strong mother, said, showing me photographs from different decades, different countries. In each one, a dark mass could be seen lurking near family members, its shape becoming more defined over time. It learned to mimic our voices. It would call out to us using the voices of our children, our parents, always leading us toward danger. Their great-grandmother tried everything to break the attachment: priests, shamans, psychics. Nothing worked. The entities followed the family when they fled to Mexico City in 1960, seeming to grow stronger with each move. By the time Isabella's parents were born, the haunting had evolved. They began manipulating physical objects. Mr. Martinez, a rational but fear-broken father, explained, pulling out his phone to show me recent video evidence. Doors don't just open and close. They slam with enough force to shatter frames. Objects don't just move. They fly across rooms like they've been thrown by invisible hands. He shuddered, and the writing on the walls. The video showed their previous home's walls covered in Spanish text that appeared to have been carved into the plaster by invisible claws. The messages were a mixture of threats and promises, all centered around one theme. The family belonged to them. Their teenage son, Miguel, a traumatized teenage son, spoke up for the first time. Last month, I woke up to find her, the veiled woman, standing over my bed. She was crying, but her tears. Miguel, a traumatized teenage son, paused, his hands shaking. Her tears were black, and where they fell on my blanket, the fabric dissolved. Ana, the youngest, a sensitive daughter, had her own encounters. The boy, a childlike figure with uncanny movements, wants to play with me, she said softly, her eyes fixed on that unseen point behind me. He says if I play his games, they'll let our family go. But he lies. They all lie. The entities had followed them through 4 moves in the United States alone. Each new home would be peaceful for exactly 3 days, what the family called the waiting period. Then the activity would resume, often more intense than before. We've learned to live with certain rules, Isabella, a gentle but strong mother, explained, showing me a list in her own journal. Never look in mirrors after sunset. Never answer if you hear a family member calling your name from another room. Never, ever play with toys that have been moved at night. But the rules weren't enough. The entities had begun physically affecting family members. Isabella, a gentle but strong mother, rolled up her sleeve to reveal 3 long scars that seemed to shimmer. In the coffee shop's light, these appeared while I was sleeping. We all have similar marks now. They're claiming us, marking us as theirs. The haunting had taken its toll. The children were homeschooled because their supernatural followers had made traditional education impossible. The family never stayed in one place long enough to form connections. They lived in constant fear of what new torments their unwanted companions would devise. The worst part, Mr. Martinez, a rational but fear-broken father, said, his voice breaking, is that they're patient. They don't want to destroy us quickly. They want to own us, generation after generation. They've already started appearing to our children's children in dreams. Isabella, a gentle but strong mother, opened her journal to a recent entry. Last week, I saw them talking to each other for the first time. The veiled woman, the boy, and the shadow thing, they stood in our living room, discussing something in a language that sounded like breaking glass. When they noticed me watching, they turned and Isabella stopped, tears welling in her eyes. They smiled. Anna, a sensitive daughter, finished for her mother. All three of them smiled, even the shadow one. And then they said, soon. As if responding to Anna's words, the coffee shop's lights flickered. A cold draft swept through the room, causing several patrons to pull their jackets tighter. The Martinez family tensed, their eyes darting to the darkened windows where night had begun to fall. We should go. Isabella, a gentle but strong mother, said quickly, gathering their journals. They're more active after sunset, and they don't like us sharing their story. She hesitated, then pressed a small object into my hand, a simple silver cross on a chain. For protection, you interviewed us. They might notice you now. As the family hurried out into the gathering darkness, I, the interviewer, looked down at the cross in my palm. It was warm to the touch, and tiny scratches covered its surface. Scratches that, when I looked closer, formed words in Spanish. They never leave. The coffee shop felt colder after their departure, the shadows deeper, the music somehow distorted. As I, the interviewer, gathered my recording equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by something that stood just beyond the range of normal vision. 1887, Rosebrook Lane stood like a wound in the earth, a Victorian monster of spires and gables that seemed to pierce the sky rather than reach for it. As I, the interviewer, pulled into the gravel driveway, the setting sun painted its weathered facade in shades of blood and rust. The house had devoured 4 families in the past century. The Stevensons would be next. Sarah Stevenson, a fearful but protective mother, waited on the wraparound porch, her slim figure silhouetted against the stained glass door. That, according to legend, had been salvaged from a burned-down church. The house has been expecting you, she said, by way of greeting. Not, we've been expecting you. The house. I would soon learn why that distinction mattered. Sarah Stevenson's hand trembled as she unlocked the massive oak door. The brass handle was ice cold despite the summer heat. Inside, the foyer stretched upward 3 stories, its walls lined with portraits of previous owners, families whose stories had ended within these walls. The realtor didn't mention these. Sarah, a fearful but protective mother, said, gesturing to the portraits. They appeared the morning after we moved in. Every time we take them down, they're back up the next day, in different positions. The house had belonged to 4 families since its construction in 1887. The Caldwells, who built it, disappeared during a dinner party in 1902. All 8 family members vanishing between the soup and main course. The Hendersons lasted 20 years before the house drove them to madness. The Blackwoods lost 3 children to accidents before fleeing in 1956. The Monroes simply stopped existing, their names vanishing from public records as if they'd never been. We bought it for a steal. Sarah's husband, Thomas, a skeptical turned resigned father, said, emerging from the library. Dark circles ringed his eyes. Now we know why. But by the time we figured it out, the house wouldn't let us leave. The Stevensons had been here for 6 months. Their teenage son, Marcus, a silent teenage son, hadn't spoken in 4. Their daughter, Emily, only 8, a young, medium-like daughter, had started having conversations with people who weren't there, or rather, weren't there anymore. Show her the nursery, Emily, a young, medium-like daughter, said suddenly, appearing at the bottom of the grand staircase. Her voice had an odd echo to it, as if someone were speaking in unison with her. The nursery, on the 3rd floor, had been sealed shut since 1902. It opened for Emily last week. Sarah, a fearful but protective mother, explained as we climbed the stairs, just unlocked itself while she was playing in the hallway. The room was a perfect preservation of the Victorian era, down to the mechanical toys and china dolls. A rocking horse swayed gently, though there was no breeze. In one corner, a music box played a tune that made my teeth ache. The house provides everything. Thomas, a skeptical turned resigned father, said bitterly. Food appears in the kitchen. The rooms clean themselves. Bills are paid from an account we can't trace. It wants to take care of us. Thomas, a skeptical turned resigned father, laughed, a hollow sound, like a farmer fattening livestock. Emily, a young medium-like daughter, walked to a dollhouse that was an exact replica of 1887 Rosebrook Lane. She opened its tiny front door, revealing miniature figures inside. "This is us now," she said, pointing to dolls in contemporary clothes. "And these are us soon." Emily turned the dollhouse around. In the miniature attic, the same dolls hung from tiny nooses. Sarah, a fearful but protective mother, snatched her daughter away from the dollhouse. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "The house, it's not just haunted, it's hungry." They showed me the evidence they'd gathered. Photographs of rooms rearranging themselves while the family slept, recordings of conversations between long-dead residents, video footage of shadows moving against gravity. But most disturbing were the changes in the house's architecture. The rooms move. Thomas, a skeptical turned resigned father, explained, leading me down a hallway that shouldn't have existed according to the blueprints. Doors open to different places depending on the house's mood. Sometimes we go to sleep in our bedroom and wake up in the parlor. Last week, Marcus, a silent teenage son, opened the bathroom door and found himself in 1902. Marcus, a silent teenage son, hadn't returned for 3 days. When he finally reappeared, he was wearing Victorian clothes and refused to speak. His eyes held the same hollow look as the figures in the portraits. The basement door rattled as we passed it. That's where it started. Sarah, a fearful but protective mother, said, "The heart of the house. We're not allowed down there." The one-time Thomas, a skeptical turned resigned father, tried. Sarah touched her husband's shoulder, where 4 parallel scars peeked out from under his shirt sleeve. In the kitchen, dinner was laying itself out. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread. None of the Stevensons had cooked in months. It knows our favorites. Emily, a young medium-like daughter, said, that strange echo in her voice growing stronger. It learns everything about us, like it learned about the others. The portraits watched us with growing interest as shadows lengthened across the foyer. Night was falling, and with it came the house's more aggressive manifestations. The walls seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Whispers echoed through heating vents. The very air grew thick with anticipation. "You should go," Sarah said urgently. "After sunset, the house doesn't like visitors. Last time my sister stayed too late." She stopped, pain flickering across her face. We haven't heard from her since. But as I turned to leave, Emily grabbed my hand. Her skin was cold as marble. "The house says you can't go yet," she said in a voice that wasn't entirely her own. "It wants you to see what happens at dinner." The front door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. In the dining room, 5 places were set at the table. The 5th place setting hadn't been there moments ago. "You might as well join us," Thomas said resignedly. "The house gets what it wants. It always gets what it wants." We sat at the ornate table, the portraits looming above us. Emily hummed a tune that matched the music box upstairs. Marcus stared at his plate with dead eyes. Sarah and Thomas held hands, their knuckles white with tension. The food was exquisite, each bite better than any meal I'd ever tasted. With every course, the room seemed to shift subtly, the wallpaper pattern changing, the ceiling growing higher, the windows slowly bricking themselves shut. By dessert, we were no longer in 2023. "It's happening again," Sarah whispered as gaslight replaced electric bulbs. "The house is hungry." Emily smiled, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "Don't worry," she said in that doubled voice. "Soon we'll all be part of the family. Forever." The portraits watched hungrily as the room continued its transformation. In the dollhouse upstairs, 5 new figures appeared in the attic. And somewhere deep below, in the forbidden basement, something that had been waiting since 1887 began to stir. I escaped 1887 Rosebrook Lane that night, though I'm still not sure how. But as I drove away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot. The next day, it was back, but the Stevensons weren't. Their portraits now hang in the foyer, their faces joining the others in their hungry watch for the next family. As I prepared for my final interview, my notes from the Stevenson house kept changing, the words rearranging themselves into warnings. But there are darker things than hungry houses in this world, as I was about to discover. Some stories aren't just told, they're survived. And the witness waiting for me had survived something that made the Stevenson house seem almost benign in comparison. There are rules when documenting supernatural encounters. Keep your distance, maintain objectivity, never become part of the story. I broke all three. The bandages on my arms still seep black fluid from the house on Rosebrook Lane. The recordings from my final interview dissolve into screams when played. My notes bleed through pages I never wrote on. But I have to finish this collection, not because the stories need to be told, because they won't let me stop. The being that calls itself Rebecca is waiting in the abandoned church on Sterling Road. It wears a face I once knew. It speaks with a voice I used to trust. And it's promised to tell me why all these stories, every haunting, every possession, every brush with things beyond our understanding, are connected. I just have to survive what it shows me first. The abandoned church on Sterling Road hadn't been a church for decades. Its stone walls were blackened, its windows blind with grime. But as I approached in the pre-dawn darkness, every stained glass window blazed with inner light, casting kaleidoscope shadows on the overgrown path. Rebecca, or the thing wearing Rebecca's face, waited at the altar. My old friend had disappeared 3 years ago while investigating a series of mysterious disappearances. The being that returned wore her smile like an ill-fitting mask. "You've collected quite a few stories," it said in Rebecca's voice, though the echoes came back in tongues that had died millennia ago. The girl who sees too much. The family stalked across continents. The house that hungers. But you haven't understood what connects them all. It moved with liquid grace, circling me. The air crackled with ancient power. Humans think of the supernatural as separate events. A ghost here, a demon there, a house that devours families. But it's all connected. Every haunting, every possession, every brush with the unknown. They're ripples from a single stone thrown into the pond of reality. The being's form flickered, revealing something vast and geometrically impossible behind Rebecca's familiar features. We've been preparing humanity for generations. The girl who sees everything, she's not unique. There are others like her, their gifts growing stronger with each generation. The family followed by entities. Think of it as an inoculation, teaching humans to cope with constant supernatural presence. My recorder melted in my pocket. Ink began to weep from the walls. Even that hungry house serves a purpose. It's a training ground. Teaching selected families how to navigate spaces where normal physics don't apply. Because soon, very soon, the boundaries between realities will shift. It showed me visions that made my mind recoil. Civilizations that existed before humanity, beings that dwelt in dimensions perpendicular to our own, futures where the walls between worlds had crumbled completely. Each supernatural encounter I documented was part of a vast preparation, getting humanity ready for something immense and inevitable. Your role, it said, reaching out with hands that cast shadows in impossible directions, is to share these stories, to help humans understand that their definition of reality is far too small. Because when the shift comes, and it is coming, fear will be their greatest enemy. The being that wasn't Rebecca smiled with too many teeth. Go, tell their stories. Tell your story. Help them understand that the supernatural isn't an invasion of their reality. It's the reality they've been blind to all along. As I turned to leave, it spoke one final time, its voice a chorus of everything that had ever existed in this ancient church. But remember, some of your audience isn't human, and they've been waiting a very long time for humanity to finally open its eyes. The church dissolved around me like mist, leaving me standing in an empty lot. My notes had changed again, the stories rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at. But now I understood why these stories needed to be told, and why this is only the beginning. As I record this, the shadows in my studio seem deeper, the silence between words longer. These stories have changed me, as I suspect they've changed you listening right now. But they've raised questions that keep me awake at night. What if every supernatural encounter is indeed connected? What if we're being prepared for something beyond our comprehension? And most unsettling of all, what if some of you watching already know why? I know you have your own stories, experiences that defy explanation, moments when reality shifted ever so slightly, showing you something you weren't meant to see. The Unexplained Haunts channel isn't just about creating a space where your stories can be heard. Share your experiences in the comments below. Tell us about those unexplained encounters that changed how you see reality. Have you ever felt like you were being prepared for something bigger? Join our growing community of truth seekers by hitting subscribe and that notification bell. Every night, we delve deeper into the mysteries that lurk at reality's edges. Tomorrow, we'll explore another series of encounters together, uncovering more evidence that these supernatural preparations are accelerating all around us. Remember, some stories aren't just told, they're survived. And sometimes, sharing them might be the most important thing we can do. Until tomorrow night, keep listening carefully. Because sometimes, they're listening too.